Hey, welcome back once again to The Real Podcast, where we, Pastor Brad and myself, are tackling the real questions that you have. This is a product of World Harvest Church, where we take the questions you had from this last week's message that you texted into the phone number that we have. It's on the message on the screen below, the lower part. And also, if you have questions now, you can actually text them. That number is 580-402-8110. Any question you have, feel free to text it in and we'll get it covered next week. But that's what I love. You know, at the beginning of this year, we set out with a revised vision of what we do here at World Harvest Church. And it's taking a real Jesus to a real world. And how many of us know we need that desperately?
Yeah, for sure.
And you said something this last week in this message. You know, these last 2 weeks, the messages we've been talking about, real relationships. And you said something that was so profound. When I heard you say it, I was like, I've never thought of it like that. For whatever reason, it's never struck me like that, but it's so true. And you said that we've been hearing in the church, Big C, the big church, as the church as a whole, we've been getting G-rated messages, but we live in an R-rated culture.
Yeah. Isn't that the truth?
It is so true because, you know, it wasn't until Brooke and I had kids that we started talking about, you know, at what point are we going to start having these challenging discussions with our kids? Because when I grew up, and I'm sure the same thing as it was with you, there were certain things you just didn't talk about. You didn't talk about it with your parents, and you definitely didn't talk about it at church. And that's not, for sure. This with the dawn of the internet age and the information age that we live in now, that's not an option. Like you either have these conversations, you know, whether they're about marriage or sex or whatever it is, you either have them or somebody else is going to have them with you and your family. And the education is going to come from someplace. The question is, who's going to be the person educating?
Right. And I think that's what we got to do, step up as the church in a real world and bring the real Jesus to, because we've got the answers according to the Word of God. And from a biblical worldview, you know, the Bible just isn't a bunch of do's and don'ts just because God set up and say, what can we do to make people's life hard, miserable? But they're the principles behind the precepts that He's given us that are for our good, for our protection. And unless we are talking about those issues in this real world we live in, people are going to fall into the traps of the adversary. I mean, we know a lot of people, including myself, early on in my marriage, there was a trap set up before me, and I started kind of going down that road. But thank God it was exposed, and I was able to deal with the situation there and walk away from it. But, you know, there's a lot of guys and a lot of people, a lot of women today that are so engrossed in a habit or addiction that it's hard for them to get free of.
Well, and it's almost like, it's amazing to me that in the world, I guess if you talk about the world as a whole, it's not a big deal. Like, it's okay because this is just out there no matter what. But in the church, for whatever reason, I say in the past, the church has had this, oh my gosh, like keep the gloves on, we're not going to talk about it. So today, the gloves come off. We're having the hard discussions, we're having the real talk. So we have a couple of great questions lined up today. But real quick before we get to them, let's recap this last Sunday, talking about not just real relationships, but marriages and the wrecks that can take place. I thought it was an awesome example. If you want to give us that summary.
The Lord gave me an analogy of like driving a car. You know, there are many people today, they're licensed to drive a car, they're driving the car. You know, there's young people that don't have their license yet, but they hope to do that someday. You know, and there are those people that kind of get older and they stop driving, you know. But for a lot of those people that's driven in a car, they're licensed to do it, but they've experienced a wreck in their life. And the Lord really showed me that's a lot the way that marriage is, because, you know, marriage, you know, immediately when you talk about marriage, there's some people that kind of shut it out. Well, I'm not married. But, you know.
So that didn't apply to me.
So it doesn't apply to me. But the thing that we got to realize, you know, our culture shifted. In the 1930s, 83% of American adults were married. Today, that number's dropped down to about 45% there, so almost half. The issue is this, I really believe, that we are losing the value for marriage in our world today. But God created it. And so if God created it, there's a reason for that. And so I think marriage is one of those topics that we all need to hear from. And especially I think one of the bigger things, too, the Lord showed me is that, using that analogy of driving the car, we're licensed to drive. There's a high percentage. I took a poll in the service yesterday, how many have ever experienced a wreck before? And almost every hand in the congregation shot up. I was shocked at the response to that. And it just made me realize that marriage is like that too, you know. Two individuals coming together as one, but there's a lot of personality and a lot of things involved there. A lot of times they ended up having a wreck. Sometimes it's a fender bender, but sometimes it's a major wreck. And we've seen relationships have a devastating wreck where the vehicle's totaled.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're able to recover and work through things. We had a great testimony yesterday of a couple here that had a major catastrophe in their marriage, but they was able to work through it through the grace of God.
Yeah.
But many don't have that testimony or can't say that, and they had to split up and walk away. But God's grace is still available there for healing to come in that moment.
And that's that insurance. You mentioned it before. That's that insurance. Is that hey,
Yeah.
when you have a fender bender, that's the insurance of who Jesus is.
Yeah, one of the
That price
guys
he
caught
paid.
me after service. I wish I would have thought it during the message there, but he said, "You forgot to mention about the insurance." I mean, insurance, what do you mean? He said, "Yeah, when you have a wreck, your insurance agent comes in and fix everything up again." I thought,
Yeah.
that's what Jesus does for us. We got to have Jesus in our life
Yeah,
for that.
yeah. So many times when you talk about marriage and challenges in marriage, because a lot of times when you say marriage, depending on the experience people have had, for some people it means something drastically different than what it means for other people. And oftentimes when you have these discussions of the wrecks that you're talking about, very quickly it happens that it becomes a he said, she said, or who was wrong, and it's this appointing who was at fault for it.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to how do you work through the disagreement? How do you work through the challenges that you have in situations like this? And before we dive into it, I just want to say, first, if you're listening to this and you've been through a divorce, you're not damaged goods.
Yeah.
This isn't a fact of it. If you've been through that before, life happens. It truly does. And it's not you weren't able to fix it, so clearly something's wrong with you. That is not the case. And this is not a condemning conversation we're having at all. It's a fact of there's life and life happens.
Yeah.
And as we get into these wrecks, how do we work our way through it? And really it comes to finding a place of agreement, kind of like
That's
you
right.
mentioned.
That's right. A passage of scripture the Lord has really been stirring in my heart a lot lately through the series is Amos chapter 3, verse 3, where it says, "How can two walk together unless they be agreed?" And I found it very interesting. I just ran into it this week in my study time, that word agreed actually means a meeting place. And it kind of caught me off guard at first, a meeting place. And I began to realize, in relationships, whenever you're walking together, it's two. We have our own perspective.
Yeah.
Even in our marriage, it says that two shall become one. And the problem is so many times when we come together as one, we're still trying to work through as individuals. We still have the mentality, well, it's you and me instead of we and us.
Yeah.
We're a new unit. And so agreement means, there's got to be a place of meeting in the middle in that. Or not necessarily in the middle even. Like you and I, if we come into a disagreement, you've got your perspective, I got my perspective. Well, if we're going to agree, there's got to be a yielding of our wills, our perspectives to find the happy medium there. And very seldom is it 50-50, but there's somewhere in the middle, there's a meeting place that you can come to, because this is what I've learned. There's no such thing as a conflict-free relationship or a conflict-free marriage. There's going to be conflict.
Amen to that.
Yeah. And so we got to learn how to deal with those conflicts, whatever it is, if it's parents and kids or employee, employer, or even in church life, husbands and wife. How can two walk together?
Yeah.
Unless we be agreed.
Yeah.
And so if we would just realize we got to find agreement, and there is agreement, I really truly believe there is agreement somewhere can be found in any relationship.
As you were talking about agreement, there's a book that I've been reading. It's called Why Are We Yelling? And it's talking about the art of agreeable disagreements. How do you have a good disagreement with somebody, and how do you come to terms where you can actually come to agreement like you were talking about? And one of the things that points out is I think if when somebody would think about the term yielding, they think, well, are you telling me that I just have to give in? That's not the case at all. It's not that you're just yielding your perspective. What you're actually doing is opening yourself up to be receptive to understanding what is the other person talking about.
Yeah.
And it really requires you to say, as much as I want you to understand what I'm saying, I need to have the desire to want to hear what you're saying, what your point of view is. And it's not just this, of saying, I'm going to give up and I'm going to agree to whatever you say, but it's truly having a desire to want to see and understand where the other person is coming from. That's critically important. And when you do that, when both persons are able to do that, you're able to find that place of agreement where you can say,
Really
what, I'm more concerned about understanding you. When the other person is more concerned about understanding me, now we can actually get somewhere because we are actually not trying to create a rebuttal to the argument, or we're not trying to convince the other person. We're truly actually just trying to understand where the other person is coming from.
And if we would just all slow down long enough to try to find some understanding of the perspective, a great analogy is this water bottle right here. Because if I ask you, Kinsley, what does that label say on the water bottle? You're going to say
purified drinking water.
Yeah. Well, you know what?
Brought to us by Great Value.
Great Value. But you know what? That's not what I see. I see that if I take this back in Oregon, I can get 10 cents back. So now I want to know which one of us is right. Well, I can argue my perspective, my viewpoint.
Yeah.
You can argue yours.
Yeah.
But until I stop and I look at your perspective,
Yeah. And turn it
oh,
on.
wow,
Yeah.
you were right.
Yeah.
Hey, well, this is what I saw.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah.
So now what has happened?
Yeah.
You had a perspective that I couldn't see. I had a perspective you couldn't see.
Yeah.
But until we stop to get understanding, well, what is it that you see?
Yeah.
How do you see that? Oh,
Yeah.
I get it now.
Yeah.
And that's such a simple example, but if we would just work that into our
Yeah.
relationships,
Yeah.
you know,
what-
it would help us.
You know what that requires? Though? It requires a willingness to observe the other side.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
you could just as easily say, I don't care what's on your side. You need to understand. You need to understand. I'm telling
right.
you, it says purified drinking water right here. But you've got to be willing to say,
Yeah.
I see what you're talking
Yeah.
about. And a lot of times, and I see this often in conflict, it requires a humble enough heart and spirit to be willing to recognize when maybe you've made a mistake.
Yeah, exactly.
And oftentimes, I've been there, I think we've all been there, where you say to yourself, this is going to be more painful to have to acknowledge that I'm wrong and to have to apologize than it is to just keep arguing my side, which doesn't make any sense in the moment.
Yeah.
But I think we've all been there where
Yeah.
you have to realize you're going to have to admit what you were looking at and the
Yeah.
frame of which you were seeing things from.
Yeah.
Which is
I don't know how
huge.
many times Tammy and I've had a disagreement and kind of got to the end, we're like, oh, we were talking about the same thing. We were wanting to accomplish the same thing. We were just looking at it from different perspectives.
Yeah. Brooke, actually, just 2 days ago, we were talking about. Do you remember when we were arguing about manners in your
yeah.
guys' kitchen? It was one of the biggest knockdown dragouts. Brooke was frustrated. My wife was frustrated. I was frustrated, and you and Tammy were just laughing about what are you guys arguing about? We actually couldn't even remember what the argument was. We just
Yeah.
knew that we were so both vested into it, and we were
Right.
so frustrated the other person couldn't see our side. To me, that speaks so much to that. What the argument, what the disagreement is,
Yeah.
really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What truly matters and what we actually remember is the interaction between you
Right.
and the interaction
Yeah.
between me.
Yeah. And how do we move ahead?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
agreement. How can two walk together? Lest
Yeah.
we be agreed.
Yeah, that's huge. So we're just blasting through the Real Podcast, answering real questions. I tell you what, if you have a question, we want to hear what your question is, and you can text us right now, literally this second as you're listening to it. Take out your phone and text 580-402-8110, and we will be able to text you, or we'll be able to cover your question in the message in the podcast and the YouTube channel next week. When we come back, we're going to be covering 2 of the challenging questions we got from this last week's message. We'll meet you right back here on The Real Podcast with Pastor Brad Mendenhall right here on World Harvest Church. Hey, welcome back to The Real Podcast. With me is Pastor Brad Mendenhall of World Harvest Church, and we're walking through not only the challenging questions of real relationships that we've been talking about this last week, but really the situation of what do you do when you have a wreck, as we were just previously talking about. What do you do when you get into these scenarios where there's hurt, there's pain, there's some serious aftermath in these relationships that we've had.
Yeah.
And one of the questions we got in this week, which was a great question, was it came from a couple who said, we'd gotten married and we just weren't good together. It's not that we're terrible people. It's that it just didn't work between the two of us. They'd gotten a divorce. They're doing great. They like each other. They're nice to their spouses. The kids get along well. And the question was, are there scenarios where divorce is actually the best course of action when people aren't agreeing? That's a loaded question. I mean, that's a real honest question, but that's a loaded question.
Yeah.
So I guess first let's start with, what does the Bible say about divorce? What does the Bible say about when divorce is okay, or when is it acceptable, and what are those bounds of release, I guess?
Yeah. The Bible addresses divorce in a few different places. One place Jesus talks about, in the instance of adultery, when you have an unfaithful spouse, in abusive situations there. But it really doesn't go into much past that. There's also a passage of Scripture that says God hates divorce. And one thing that people need to realize, like a car wreck, I hate car wrecks. I hate them when they happen. But, God hates divorce, but he doesn't hate divorced people. And that's one thing we got to make sure that we correlate. And the reason why I think that it says that is because of the devastation that happens a majority of the time.
Yeah.
Now, the question that came into us, that's really the exception. We don't hear that response too many times because a majority of the time, when a divorce happens, when a major wreck happens, and the marriage is destroyed, usually the devastation of that is very much in the two individuals that was in the marriage. And if there's kids involved, the kids are now the ones that really have to carry the brunt of the damage for a long time, which is even more serious in that.
Yeah.
So, when we look into the scriptures there, I've had a lot of people say, well, the only reason why I ever divorce is if there's, the infidelity in the marriage. But, it's a little tricky, and that's a pretty good question.
Yeah. Yeah. It's especially challenging when you think about, at times there's one individual who wants to get a divorce and the other person's like, no, not at all. I don't.
Yeah.
I want to be able to fix this. I want to be able to amend this. Yeah. And again, when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of what that is, at times, God gave us all free will, the ability to make our own decisions, the ability to live our own life, and to be able to walk life through with us as we make these decisions. But there's consequences for those decisions. And I know there's, many of our listeners and people in our congregation said, I didn't want this. I had no desire for this to take place. When we go back to the insurance that we were talking about there are times where things happen to us we have no control over. We have no control. It's not that God was smiting us. It's not that he was spiting us. It's not that he had anything. But literally, our life was impacted by the choice of somebody else. When we sort through that, how do you walk through that? How do you recover from that? Of saying, because like you said, there's exceptions to it where divorce, in this case, the question we got in, maybe it did make sense. We'll come back to that in a second because I would say, why did it make sense at the beginning? Maybe there was something at the very beginning of the relationship that maybe wasn't going to work at the beginning, but only was identified later. But real quick, let's stay on this point of if your life has been impacted by somebody else, and in this relationship you're left with the hurt, and they left. Where do you start from? Where do you start over from?
Well, definitely you got to go to Jesus.
Yeah.
Because in a rift like that, I used the example of two different colors of Play-Doh yesterday in the message about how the two become one and how I meshed them together.
Yeah.
And to separate them, you're never going to separate them back to the original state because there's always going to be, parts of the other in the division in that. But, I believe that the grace of God is so sufficient for every situation. And so spiritually speaking, you got to get back to God. You got to work on the relationship with Jesus. You got to get to the place of wholeness into your life, because one thing that always concerns me is when there's the rift happens, the pain is there, and they immediately, as quick as they can, they jump into another relationship trying to bring a wholeness and a healing to their life because of another person in their life. That's not the answer.
Yeah.
When a divorce happens, a wreck happens, just like in a physical car wreck, you got to get whole first. You got to get healed up yet before you can go back to start driving again. Things have got to be fixed. Things have got to be repaired in that.
Yeah.
I mean, getting into the Word of God, and I tell you, one of the things that I've grown to value more than anything in my life besides the Word of God is other people. This is why I think groups are so important, that we come around other people. We know God loves us, but there's something about walking hand in hand with somebody else in our life, especially those that's been through it before, just knowing, what, I can look at your life. I'm not saying you and I have, but, if you've been through something that I'm dealing with now, well, Kinsley made it through.
Yeah.
There's hope for me.
Yeah.
Because the devil loves to play the blame game. Yeah. Well, nobody knows the pain you're feeling. Nobody knows what you're going through in your life.
This is just a you problem.
Just a you problem, but it's not.
Yeah.
And there's help and there's hope out there to be found. And you just got to be willing to go find it.
Yeah. So to play opposite advocate, I'm not going to give the devil any ground. To play opposite advocate, I think there's a lot of people who'd say, okay, great. That's a real Christianese statement to make, of saying you just got to go to Jesus.
Yeah.
But I'd like to offer this is it's not a cliche. It's not Christianese.
Yeah.
Because when we as Christians say, hey, you got to trust Jesus, you got to run to him as your source, as your solution, as your hope to the problem, is because as believers, there's a couple of baselines we have to believe. One, that there is a God.
Yeah.
The basics. And when you go through trauma and tragedy, sometimes you got to go back to the basics. Is one, do you believe there is a God? Yes or no? Yeah. As believers, yes, we know there is a God. We've seen the evidence not only scientifically, but also evidence all throughout life. I mean, the more science dives into it, the more support there is that there is a God, there is creation. He was the developer and creator of it all. So one, is there a God? Two, did he have a son, Jesus? Yes, there's archaeological, scientific information and data for that proves there was Jesus. And there is manuscripts and history and testimony of who he was and what he brought to life. And three, does his kingdom still live? Is what Jesus done on the cross, his sacrifice, his death, his resurrection, was that real? Yes, it was real. I mean, that's not just me and my opinion saying that. I mean, I'll be honest. I think we've all walked through the point in our lives where we've questioned, was Jesus real? For me, I had to dive into the archaeological findings and the science behind it and the actual truth data that science could be able to support.
Yeah.
And what I found was there was more data for Jesus existing than not. Yeah. So if you find yourself saying, you know what, you Christians, you say you just got to trust Jesus. When we say that, when we say you need to run to Jesus, we're not just tossing up a hope and a prayer. We're saying there is more scientific evidence and backing for the support of who Jesus is and what he does in your life than there is for there not being Jesus. Yeah. So when we say that, it's not a cliche statement of, oh, you just got to put your faith and believe. It's a putting your nose to the grindstone, getting into what the Word says, because the Word is not only true, but it's consistent. And not just believing, but applying it to your faith. The Word says that faith without works is dead, and oftentimes we misconstrue that works part as saying, well, you have to do a lot of things to achieve it. But actually, when you actually look at the verses and the chapters, what it's talking about is the work is the application of your faith to a situation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Faith without works is dead, because if you do not apply your faith in work to the scenario, in action to the scenario, then what good is your faith? You have to. So when when we make those statements of saying you've got to trust Jesus, we're saying it's okay to boil it down and ask the questions and say, why does this hurt so bad? Jesus, what is it? But when we do reach out to Jesus, it's not just in a hope, it's an expectation.
Yeah, and whenever we go through something devastating like that, what happens, there's that void that's created, the hurt and the pain that's there.
Yeah.
And when we talk about going to Jesus, it's in that relationship that we have with Jesus Christ, and he begins to fill in those gaps and those voids in our life in that. And
because he's real.
Yeah, in one of the messages, I think 2 weeks ago, I used the analogy of a cup, because we're imperfect people serving a perfect God. We're all on the journey of transformation, so we all have work to do. So we all have a little bit of gap in us. And some people think, well, if I would just remarry again or jump into something else and look to somebody else to fill that gap, then I'll be whole. But the problem is that we look at our life mathematically. In math, 2 halves make a whole.
Yeah.
But in our real life, in the real world, 2 broken people don't make one whole person. 2 broken people equals a really messed up couple.
Yeah. I've heard the example of Swiss cheese. You put 2 pieces of Swiss cheese, there's still going to be some holes there, even though you may think that it's not going to.
And that's why it's important that we do go to Jesus, that we go to the cross.
Yeah.
That God loves us, he cares for us, and let him heal those hurts. God's bigger than divorce. I mean, he's bigger than anything we'll ever face.
What does it mean for him to heal those hurts? Yeah. Because if I'm listening to this and I've heard about Jesus, I've been maybe I've been disconnected from church. I had my parents' faith, but it really hasn't been what does it mean for it to allow God to heal the hurts? Because I've met several people who have said, I'd love to. How does he do it?
Yeah.
And when is he going to take the pain away?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things we got to get to is when we come to Jesus, especially in a relational wreck, is we got to forgive. That's really usually the first step.
Wow.
We got to forgive. Because as long as we hold on to the bitterness, or let me rephrase that, as long as we hold on to the situation that hurt us, then it will turn to bitterness. And when it turns to bitterness, then we start producing bitter fruit in our life. And so if we'll get to the place, and it's hard when people do us wrong, that you got to forgive, but that's the first step. We got to forgive.
Yeah.
And this is what I know about forgiveness. To forgive is an act, but forgiveness is a journey.
Wow.
In that. It's kind of like our salvation. When we get saved, it's an act we did, but then we walk it out. Forgiveness is the same way. You can forgive somebody, but a lot of times you still have the emotions of it that's attached to that. But the forgiveness part of that is then beginning to release that person from the offense and beginning to let the healing take place.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can happen instantly.
Yeah.
When Lord, I forgive them. Then all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, I'm free. But I've had people really hurt me hard and deep, and I forgave them, but I still had to deal with emotions. But when the trigger points would come into my brain and the thoughts would come, I thought, no, I forgave them.
Yeah.
I forgave them.
Yeah.
And the further I got away from
done.
that, and
forgave them,
remembering
it's
that,
done.
then I was able to detach the emotions from it. It's kind of like a scar, after the wound, it's very sensitive. You can't hardly touch it. But as it begins to heal, eventually it gets to be something that's just a mark on your life that has no feeling there. And you remember it as a historic event, not as something that is fresh and wounding to us still.
Yeah. And for some of us, that's, that's a course of a year. For some of us, that's a course of many years of walking through that. And I think one of the things that often gets missed is when you say, I just want to be past this pain, you're absolutely right. It's not a magic pill you take. It's an action that you have to be able to be willing to walk through to say, first, in order for me to be able to move this, in order for God to be able to move in my life, we do have to walk in that forgiveness, and we have to be willing to walk through that journey of wanting to forgive and being willing to forgive, because there's been several times, even in my own life, I said, I don't want to forgive them.
Yeah. Yeah. Feels good to hold it.
I'm not going to let them out of this. I don't want to forgive them.
Yeah.
I want them to have to revel in this. I want to hold it. But what it is, it's toxic.
Yeah.
It's toxic to your own life because you're not giving it up.
Yeah.
Forgiving is not just about them. More than anything, it's releasing you to no longer
right.
be bound by the pain and the hurt that was holding you back.
Yeah. Carrying unforgiveness in our life is like me drinking poison, hoping you're going to die.
Please don't do that. Please don't
it's
do
more
that.
damaging to me than it is to you.
Yeah.
And that.
Hey,
So we got to release it.
There's one more question that I thought was really important before we blast out of here today, and it was this. We talked about divorce. We talked about there were the bookends, as we talked about. There are the outliers to the bell curve of the average of what happens. But another great question that came into us was, we talked about getting things right, and that sometimes if there are those cases where divorce was probably maybe the best thing that happened to some people or a couple of people, what would have led to that? Like, what would have led to the point of, could it have been found that maybe that marriage wasn't right, or they weren't the right person in their life earlier on? And the question specifically came to, how do we know who the one is, who the right person is?
Yeah. I think trying to answer it real quickly, not real long, I think if you got to start right. And I think many times I've seen that people don't start right.
Yeah.
And because a lot of times we're very emotional beings. We can be driven by emotions or, even testosterone, we're like, baby, let's go.
Yeah.
But we got to slow down.
Quote
because
that, by the way.
It's a decision. It's a decision that's going to affect you.
Yeah.
And I think this is why I'm a big advocate for, premarital counseling.
Yeah.
Taking the time, talking through things, taking a look at your makeup, your spouse's, your fiance's makeup, and let's just see how this thing's going to fit together. Because if you start bad, it's not. Well, we're going to get married, so all the problems are going to go away.
Yeah.
No way.
It does not happen.
When the marriage takes place, anything that's there is magnified, good and bad.
Yeah.
And so it's important that you take care of it up in the front side.
Yeah.
In that, and and it goes back to the be an agreement. You can come to an agreement on things, but you got to start right.
Yeah.
Toxicity in marriage, if it's not dealt with, it will lead to divorce. There's a lot of dysfunction in those things. And so, again, that's the exception to that, but it does happen. So I think my best advice is you just got to make sure you start right. And, the idea of the one, I'm an advocate to believe in anybody can make it in a marriage by doing the right thing. But you really do need to start right in that. So, because it's not about marrying right, it's about doing what's right.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a conversation we had as we wrap up here that in talking about that, the right one, it's so important to be able to go back to the Lord. And again, it'd be easy to say, well, that's a cliche statement, but the reality is to be able to go back to the Lord and trust Him more in the foundations of your relationship than you do your own opinions. Because again, as believers, we believe a couple of things. One, there is a God. Two, there is Jesus, and He is more real than you and I sitting here in the flesh.
Yeah.
If that is the case, which it is, then that means that the person that you're interested in marrying also was created by the Creator. And who knows His creation better than the Creator? He does. So when you get into a relationship, a lot of times it's exciting to be in a relationship. It's exciting to be dating. It's exciting to, frankly, not be alone. I remember that many times that you would date just for the fact I don't want to be by myself. But when you go back to the Lord and trust Him and say, hey, God, I trust You in this, and I lay this relationship, but I need the confirmation. I need you to give me the peace that this is the right person. I've known people that said, man, that was a great breakup. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You just broke up with the person. It's like, yeah, but we both agreed that we weren't the right person for each other. And it was a great breakup.
Yeah.
And that all comes back to the ability to trust God and what he's telling you, and that peace that surpasses every circumstance and situation, because he knows them better than you know them. And he knows where they're going to be 5 years from now. He knows the type of person they're going to develop into and the type of your person you're going to develop into. He knows who that is.
Right.
So who better to trust in the beginning and the foundation of a relationship than the one who made both of you?
That's right.
So
let me throw something in here just real quickly
please.
before you wrap us up. I just, in my experience of life, I believe that God brings that person into our life. Mm-hmm. There's a high majority of the time that I've always seen. I think sometimes I just wonder if the enemy knows that God's getting ready to bring somebody into our life, because I can't tell you how many times I've witnessed this. I've witnessed myself. I've witnessed in a lot of other people. It seems like right before God brings that one person in, somehow somebody else slips in right in front of them.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems like, everything's really good except this thing.
Yeah.
And we're like, but I can get by with that.
And or I can fix it.
Or I can fix it. And luckily, I mean, we don't talk about it a lot. Tammy was engaged to be married when we started dating.
Wow.
I had a girl, about a year before I met Tammy. I thought, she's going to be the one.
Yeah.
But this little thing here, and I see that happen so many times. Yeah. So I would encourage people there, if you really want to know the one, just give it a little time and pray about it. And if there's any question, slow down. Because there may be God getting ready to position the one that he is bringing you.
That's wild. Until you said that, I didn't realize it. Brooke and I both were in serious relationships before we both swore off dating. We're like, whatever, we're done. And then we actually met each other. That's amazing.
I see a high majority of that.
That's wild. Yeah. Wow. Well, hey, be encouraged today that if that's you and you're saying, I think everything's great except this one thing, don't make exceptions, because God makes things perfect when we truly trust him
in his time.
It doesn't mean that you're looking for the perfect person, but what we're doing is waiting for the perfect moment of when God brings those things together. And you can trust God. You really, truly can. Yeah. Hey, it's been so much fun, as it always is right here on The Real Podcast. Remember, don't forget to, if you have questions, we want to hear them. We want to hear them here. So text 580-402-8110. Send your question to us, and we'll make sure we get it covered next week, as long as there's not too many questions. Hey, thanks so much for Real Talk right here on Real Podcast, a production of World Harvest Church, and we'll see you next week.